And finally, of course, the fact that Estonia is joining, it's the same like the breakthrough in '97 with the invitation to the EU, that it crossed the red line. Before we were perceived as in a post-Soviet space where it was a no-go zone for the EU and NATO. And today it's, remember exactly what were the headlines everywhere in the international press 2 years ago. It was all about Latvia is on the brink of devaluing its currency. And the next sentence everywhere was always, and surely Estonia and Lithuania will have to follow. So now if Estonia comes into the euro, it's good for Estonia, but I would argue that it should also positively affect the reputation of Latvia and Lithuania as well, and the Baltic region as a whole, if one of the Baltic economies have come out of this successfully. So I'll stop there.
Well, to encourage the discussion, I would ask the usual question probably, which you get. How would you explain the ability of Estonian political elite to have stronger consensus on major, at least economic policy decisions, so that changes in government or ruling coalition don't affect so much policy which has been decided before? I know that from inside Estonia, Estonians think they are disagreeing a lot about various things, but I think it is actually this consensus, as you said, which is one of the key factors behind a more consistent policy of Estonia compared to Latvia and Lithuania. So what, in your opinion, are the main reasons for this?
Many perhaps have failed to notice is, in fact, the same Prime Minister's party, the Reform Party, which is the economically liberal party, has actually been in government since 1999. They haven't led the government for most of this time, but they've always been a coalition partner. Siim Kallas, who is now our commissioner in Brussels, from '99 was the finance minister. He was the key person. So they've occupied those ministries all those years. So there's been a pretty strong continuation in policy, and this is a sort of continuation from the Mart Laar early governments from '92 as well. And I would say the Estonian political spectrum compared to Lithuania and even Latvia has always been very strongly to the right of center. Even our social democrats were embarrassed to use the name Social Democrats for many, many years. They were, until 2000 and I believe it was 2001, they were part of the European Socialists naturally, and received funding from there, of course, but they were known as the moderates, and their color was not red, but it was orange and green, and their symbol was not a red rose, but a green apple. So even the Social Democrats were very much tilted to the right of center. So there's been a strong consensus, and this government, when Ansip completes this term, this will be a remarkable achievement for Estonia and Latvia. No one's done this before, that a government that started its term between the two elections will actually complete its term. That's never happened. And Ansip is now it was Brazauskas, the late Brazauskas, but Ansip is now the longest continually governing prime minister, and it looks like he has a pretty good chance of continuing, though now, as I said, there's already talk about stagnation under Ansip, and that the Reform Party has run out of new ideas, and that should be renamed. It's no longer the Reform Party, but it's the Standstill Party. But again, looking from the outside, if you read Ed Lucas's comments in The Economist, then of course he has only praise for them. But they've worked very good. They kicked out the Social Democrats from the coalition a year ago, because the Social Democrats argued for raising taxes rather than cutting. So there's been pretty strong cohesion amongst them, and the societal consensus I don't want to go into any sort of pseudo explanations about Estonian individualism, but there does seem to be a sort of very strong consensus which comes from already the drive to independence, that we have to distance ourselves from everything from the Soviet legacy and do everything the opposite, to still follow the Milton Friedman playbook. When Mart Laar became prime minister, he said he's only read one book about economics, and that's Milton Friedman, and that's what he followed. I didn't understand it all, but he had the courage to push it through, and good thing that he didn't read too many other competing theories.
I would be interested to know a little bit more about what you called the idea of obliging the three countries to get more integrated in the process of getting to EU and NATO. Maybe would you say a word about that? As today we see these three countries are as economically very strong competitors, and it's difficult to hear, as you said, any other kind of integration other than in defense cooperation field.
You might remember that no one was willing to sell us any offensive weapons in the early 90s, and BALTBAT, the Baltic Peacekeeping Battalion, the first big joint Baltic institution, military unit in '95, was partly used. It was under the command of the Danes in the former Yugoslavia, and it was that unit which got the first proper equipment, offensive equipment that could actually kill somebody. Otherwise, we had the Swedes were giving us their old bicycles, and the East Germans their boots and things like that. But Baltic, the peacekeeping battalion was the first step of, once you could donate or sell weapons, then it could be expanded to the regular military as well. So cooperation in the military sense, of course, was very enthusiastic. In the other fields, well, not. I mean, culturally, how much do we know of each other? Like things like, well, in the Soviet period, of course, there was very many translations of Estonian and Lithuanian literature. There's probably very little of that today. Of course, that was a feature of the Soviet system, that all the fraternal nations had their works of art, works of literature translated. But there's very little of that kind of interaction between us today. Of course, there is interaction in the sense economically that there's a lot of multinational corporations who they see the Baltic as one market. So you have, I mean, I have a lot of Estonian friends who come regularly to Riga and Vilnius because they happen to work for, say, Swedbank or one of the big corporations. So that's a force for integrating the region again. But I'm not so pessimistic about Baltic cooperation, because, of course, being inside the European Union, I think we cooperate very much. There's a Baltic Sea strategy should be an impetus for this. But again, military cooperation has gone perhaps the other direction, because if we look at our involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan, we had the same policy lines. We were there for the same reasons. So in that sense, we're following the same logic. But we weren't serving together. There weren't joint Baltic. We all wanted, Lithuania has its PRT and is very proud of that. The Estonians are very keen on being able to fight together, first with the British and the Americans in Helmand, and that's most important for us to have that experience. We don't want to be fighting together side by side with the Latvians or Lithuanians. For us, we want to be with the Americans, and I think you have that's the experience that we need there. A funny thing to my mind is also Estonia was probably the only country that left Iraq involuntarily. All the other European countries scrambled to get out of there, withdraw as quickly as possible, and in January 2009, Estonia was trying to sign still a status of forces agreement with the Iraqi government, which George Bush had secured for the US right before leaving office, and the Iraqis wouldn't sign it with anybody else. But the Estonians desperately want to stay, not because of the sake of the Iraqis, but because we were serving under the Americans, and that direct cooperation with our most important ally was highly valued. But the Iraqis said, thanks, you've done a nice job, but you're no longer necessary. And our defense ministry sent several delegations in December 2008, January 2009 to Baghdad to plead that please sign the status of forces agreement so we can stay in Iraq, which I mention only as a tidbit that this would seem bizarre in Western Europe. But the logic, I think, there of cooperation is not a Baltic cooperation, but the importance of cooperating with our big and important allies, and well, first and foremost there with the United States. But there's also formats, as we mentioned here earlier with you, there's plenty of these think tank, semi-formal roundtables, dialogues. There's this French-Baltic one that just met in Paris recently. There's a German-Baltic one, and it's always much easier. It's very difficult, when I organize a lot of events like this myself in Estonia, and our Western European colleagues mostly assume that, okay, we'll organize in Riga and everyone can come from Vilnius and Tallinn and it'll work fine. No, it never works like that. If you organize it in Paris, you organize it in Berlin, then you can get a proper representation from all three Baltic countries equally. But the idea that you can get within the Baltic states, just practically in my experience, never works. So I organize an event in Tallinn, and to think that I will get an equal number and high level Latvian and Lithuanian representation, no way. But if the coordinator from Berlin or Paris will think, of course, it's all the one region, it'll work like that. But it'll only happen if you take the three Balts to a separate location outside the region.
Why do you think Baltic Assembly is so not popular within Estonians? Do you think it's just because three Baltic countries are too individual and want to be the lead, that's why we can't get that energy agreement?
So you'd call it the lack of Baltic emotion. We are together, we realize we shared the same fate and the same destiny, and we cooperate pragmatically, but there's no great love or passion in having to deal with each other, that it seems like it's a bit of a burden or an obligation that of course we have a sort of moral responsibility to cooperate, but it doesn't come from sort of burning inside that yes, that the three of us just love being together, that we are just suited to be. I mean, there's a few exceptions that we get along terrifically, but on average, that's not the case as at all. But specifically about the Baltic Assembly, Estonia has been for several years pushing a change in its format, which Latvia and Lithuania have been against, and Estonia will take over again the assembly and is going to start pushing this agenda again. And I think it makes sense. The work of the assembly would be much more effective if it wasn't organized as big delegations. Now you have 20, 20, and 20 parliamentarians from each country who come, and they're sort of a random bunch. But to actually get something done, you should actually have meetings between, and then they form ad hoc committees when the parliament meets. That instead they should have the same committees that are the regular committees, say the Estonian, Latvian, Lithuanian Foreign Affairs Committees, the Estonian, Latvian, Lithuanian Economic Affairs Committees. The Foreign Affairs Committees meet regularly amongst themselves, but the Economic Affairs supposedly have never met amongst themselves. So it should be the Estonian, Latvian, Lithuanian parliamentarians who meet, who actually make decisions in that field regularly, who deal with that, who meet amongst each other. But in the Baltic Assembly, you get 20 parliamentarians who don't really want to be there so much, and then they are put into an ad hoc committee that, okay, you guys talk about foreign affairs, you talk about economics, and they have it doesn't feed back into the system. When they go back to their own parliament, they're not members of that same committee back home, so it has no impact. So that would be, I think, an effective reform.